America's founders are calling. It's your opportunity to respond. This is the Liberty Brief Podcast with your host, Robert Melso, featuring Dr. Thomas Giordano. Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the Liberty Brief Podcast. I'm your host, Robert Melso, and today we will further our discussion with Dr. Thomas Giordano, author of the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters. In the last episode, well, let me start out by saying we went over a lot of information in these first 2 episodes, but in the last one, we took a brief stroll down from our origins in prehistory through the early beginnings of modern human development and onto the foundations of our Western civilization. We talked about the importance of our written history in recording simultaneous cultural, philosophical, and religious and political advances made in the Greco-Roman world. They're merging with the Judeo-Christian traditions of Roman Catholic theologians and the beginnings of thought about natural law, from which we derived our natural rights. We also talked a little bit about property rights and citizenship in ancient Athens and the early Roman Republic. I think I've got that right. Anyway, Dr. Giordano explained how the Greek experience clearly marked the beginning of Western civilization. And today, we're going to expand that look at private property ownership in the ancient world and how that's impacted upon our Western civilization. So with that, I would like to greet you. Hello, Dr. Tom. It's good to talk to you again.
Hello, Rob. Good evening. How are you?
Before we start, first of all, our last podcast generated quite a bit of interest. People, they wanted to understand how a doctor with little formal education in philosophical medieval history came to know about ancient and medieval history as it applies to Western philosophy. You know, it's interesting in and of itself that our audience, some of them very well educated, have never heard about the influence of early Greek, Roman, and even Arabic thought that our founders that had on our founders and our Constitution. So let's establish that first, if you don't mind. Perhaps you can just tell us where you got these ideas and how they came to be.
Well, where I got the ideas, it came from basically what people would claim are first sources. Now, if anybody had read the book that I wrote, they would understand that my father inculcated in me at a very young age the curiosity to follow these things. He gave me some lessons on this material. Now, you're right. I don't have a formal education in philosophy or in history, but I know how to read. My interests were in other things, and I followed my own interests. And my father was probably proud of me for doing it, but I was more interested in the biological sciences and in healthcare and things like that than I was in following this as a profession. And therefore, a formal education meant nothing to me as far as this material went, because it is, I wasn't seeking a piece of paper to put on a wall to show everybody how much, I had, what kind of time I dedicated to it.
Well, while you were reading Cicero and Aristotle and so forth, I was reading comic books in the 9th and 10th grade.
No, not me. Not me. I probably spent more time on my own reading this material than most people do in a curriculum to get a bachelor's or a master's in it. Like I said, this was for my own edification. I wasn't trying to use it as a means to provide a living for myself. There was a point in my life where I had I guess you would call it I don't exactly know how to describe it, but in the book, I even recounted this story about how one day I went down into the woods when I was 9 years old. I was waiting for a bunch of my friends to show up, and they didn't. and I had an epiphany.
I remember reading about that, Dr. Tom.
And that's what guided me on studying biology and the biological sciences and things like that. Of course, in that particular field, I had to study other scientific fields like physics and chemistry, biochemistry, general biology. Aside from the more advanced mathematics and things like that, it was part of my core curriculum. But history was basically an elective in my education, and I really didn't feel like there was the need for me to get a formal education in history because I had the capability of reading on my own.
Well, we'll get your reading list from you someday, but it's in the book for those that are interested in a deeper
aside
dive.
From that,
but we're going to go.
Excuse me. Aside from that, there is one thing that I did do, though. I speak 5 languages, and studying those languages gave me insight into primary materials in the original languages in which they were written. So even if I were studying history, I would not be studying secondhand translations. My Latin is pretty good. My ancient Greek is relatively good, but I speak 5 languages fluently, and this actually gave me a great aid in studying these concepts, because the languages fundamentally, as far as Latin goes, I would say 90% of all of our history as in the Western civilization is written in the Latin language. And it's just fascinating. I mean, I was able to study my own genealogical background going back 23 generations because I read Latin. And I was able to get all of the information that I needed from the archives here in Italy. And it was all written in Latin, and I could read it in the original language. So, these are the things that basically my father stimulated in me. And I could care less about a formal education, because formal educations just fill you up with knowledge. They don't give you wisdom. It's a big difference. Knowledge is one thing. It's just accumulation of archival memory. But if you don't know what to do with that knowledge, no wisdom can be gained from it.
Well, Tom, for your information, I speak 2 fluent languages, English and South Philly.
Oh, I forgot the dialects. hey, yo. Yeah, you better go get Hyde.
Okay, let's start off. Let's start off here.
Okay.
I would say that what comes to mind to most people when they think of ancient Greece, they talk about mythology, democracy, perhaps art, philosophy, literature, architecture, maybe some mathematics and geometry as well. But when we talk about property rights, it really doesn't end there. Am I right?
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. You see, most people have a smattering of, when they think of ancient Greece, they'll think of the Spartans. They'll think of Leonidas at Thermopylae against Xerxes, or they may think of, Greek mythology. But that common impression is really based upon the written works of urban authors that survive to this day. In other words, the farmers were busy farming, and they didn't have time to write. But you can get an idea of what their lives were like by reading Hesiod, Works and Days, and Theogony. Works and Days gives you the background of what it was to be a farmer. It was a life of hard work, struggle, and a quest for honor and the good life. So the Greek contribution to the Western world is far greater than what you've mentioned. Even though these alone would have been enough to be a great source of pride.
All right. So what can you tell us about the idea of private property, ownership, and their effects?
Well, I think this is a concept that is very, very much underappreciated. The results of, let's say, the resultant effects of private property on Greek economics and cultural progress were indispensable. In addition, the Greek customs and institutions that that guarded private property were an absolutely exceptional phenomenon in the ancient world. Owning private land in Persia or Egypt, let's say, was not even considered. They didn't even think about owning private land. And really, it couldn't be found anywhere else in the ancient world until the Roman Republic was founded and then carried on the same tradition. It also gives us a perfect example of how a minimal government can be of great benefit to the public. And I'm absolutely sure that this was not lost on our founding fathers, the founding fathers of our country.
Well, this is a big beef of mine. I think that government is just becoming more and more consuming in the United States. But I would say that, my question would be, isn't this where Thomas Jefferson got the idea that the government that governs best governs least?
Oh, it was most likely one source of that notion. You see, the lack of a centralized political control was demonstrably fundamental to the swift progress of Greek civilization. For about 500 years, somewhere between 800 and 300 BC, the Greek polis and their colonies around the Mediterranean and Black Seas had no kings to declare a claim to what they referred to as earth and water. Instead, hundreds of self-governing city-states arose haphazardly over time with full political independence. These thrived enormously by imposing the rule of law rather than the rule of an individual. And that rule of law is very important to us as well. There was a solid sense of equality before the law, and this set down the cornerstones for our Western democracy.
Well, there's some question about the impartial dispensing of the rule of law in today's society. We see it all the time, I think, in current events. We can go there maybe a little bit later, but from our last discussion, didn't you suggest that the institutions and circumstances in each polis varied? For instance, Sparta was totalitarian and Athens was a democracy, a liberal democracy. And that seems like one extreme to another.
Oh, yeah, that's right. They had the liberty to follow any tradition they wanted. But there are a few things that we must never forget. Though they had no sense of nationality nor ethnicity, people all over Hellas spoke the same language. They had the same pantheon of gods, the same cultural background, mythology and legends and the like. They admired the same heroes, the same athletes, the same educators, and the same warriors. They all recognized the value of the oracle at Delphi and tried to interpret and follow the enigmatic answers they received before any major endeavor. But they were also well aware of the distinction between man-made laws and customs, what they called nomoi, and natural law. The first being completely changeable ideations of men. They were capricious ideations of men. And the second being an immutable constant of nature.
You're reminding me of the idea of the states versus the federal government. Each state has the ability to govern itself within reason, and the federal government overlays that. And so we pledge allegiance to the federal government, but we have the right and the ability within the states to experiment.
Exactly. And that is the structure.
So you're saying that although they had a common heritage for all intents and purposes, they had no sense of allegiance to anything outside their own city-state.
Exactly. They had no sense of allegiance. Did you know that they didn't even refer to themselves as a common people? They didn't even call themselves Greeks or Hellenes or Achae, or they had no sense of unity. When they were fighting the Persians, for example, you had 1,500 city-states. Only 35 of them united to fight the Persians. The other ones, they couldn't care less. It's, well, hey, we'll see what happens. But yes, in a political sense, that's right. They had no allegiance outside for anything outside of their own city-state. But I have to make this very clear. There was an even more basic commonality among the Hellenes, which is even more fundamental and really predated any political organization. There was an absolute loyalty and reverence to their genealogical ancestry and their families. The freedom that Greek citizens treasured was based upon inclusion in a society of people with equal standing. This was in stark contrast to what was on the other side of the Hellespont, to the hierarchy of Oriental tyrants where subjects served superiors, a king or a great king, in exchange for privileges. The keystone for freedom to a Greek citizen was rooted in the security that his polis governed with a recognition of and a sacred respect for his property rights. Because of this grounding, the affairs of state were public and not the private whims of any individual despot. Now, this is very important. Now, I don't mean to imply that all Greeks were citizens. They weren't. Women and children and slaves had no political rights. In the early times, neither did immigrants or foreigners or non-citizens who came to live and work in the Greek cities. Nevertheless, there was an undeniably more widespread representation in civic affairs than there was in any other ancient civilizations at that time.
So why was the idea of private property ownership unique to Greece? I mean, why did the idea come from Greece and not from any other area in the ancient world? What did they have as an advantage that gave them this head start?
Well, I could sum it up in 2 words: geography and climate. If you take a good look at the topography of Greece, you'll immediately notice how rugged and choppy the terrain is. It's mountainous and has deep valleys. It has very thin soil, which is not really favorable to agriculture. Also, as you go from the valleys up the mountains, there are a few different microclimates which change the ability to grow certain crops and favor others which have different seasons for harvest. The Greek farmers were deep-rooted in their land by ancestral claims and hallowed family traditions. Each family regarded their property as a sacred boundary, protecting its holy hearth and home. Even the marking of property boundaries was a religious ceremony. They were fiercely independent people and owed a deeply felt sense of honor to their ancestors to maintain what they labored over to provide to their offspring. By the way, it's interesting because this tradition was later seen in Rome, where stones were placed at the corners of property boundaries following a religious ritual sacrifice. These sacred stones were named for the god Terminus and are referred to as lapidis terminalis. Every year, a festival called the Terminalia was held on the 23rd of February, which was the end of the old Roman calendar year. The owners of adjacent lands got together at the common boundary stone, and each put fragrant garlands on his side of the stone. They then offered cereal grains, pastries, honey, and wine, and a pig or a lamb was sacrificed. It is interesting that these stones generally bore an inscription, concede nulli, meaning concede nothing or concede no ground. Now, I would imagine that the Greeks held a similar ceremony, considering their comparable regard for property ownership. Anyone who removed a boundary stone was damned by the god Terminus, or Terminus, as they would pronounce it, and risked a death penalty. This was later replaced with a fine.
You know, it's funny you're talking about putting fragrant flowers on the corners of your boundary. It reminds me a little bit about my dog marking our territory.
Exactly.
But so this is where the word terminate comes from, like Terminator.
Exactly.
I'll be back kind of thing.
Yeah.
I imagine it would create the kind of a sense of reverence, knowing that you're working the same land that many generations of your forefathers had worked before you. And in addition, what I'm sensing is from the microclimate, these farmers had a very intimate knowledge of their land. And in fact, they were specialists. Somebody else couldn't come and know that land and know how to farm it because they're not familiar with that particular soil or microclimate.
Exactly. They would say grow grains in the valleys, and as they went up the hills, they would start growing grapes, and then higher up they would grow olives, and they knew exactly where to plant these plants where it would be most favorable. The Greeks, we have to understand that their property came to them from the mists of the past, and by virtue of their religious beliefs, they were improving themselves by cultivating the soil that nourished and enriched them. They also had complete control over their property and administered their own affairs. So you're exactly right. They knew the lands better than any invader.
Well, today we buy and sell properties all the time. In fact, I think Americans move about every 7 years or so. They don't really have a sense of nostalgia or strong ties to their homes. It seems it wasn't like this for the Greeks.
Yes, apparently. The transfer of property from one family to another was a religious ritual, and it was really problematic. But at the same time, because the transfer needed endorsement by religion, there was a very strong barrier to governmental expansion. The appropriation of land for public use, what we would call eminent domain today, was an unknown concept to the ancient Greeks. A man could not be deprived of his property against his will. A seizure could only be done in the event of being sent to exile or being condemned to exile.
So it seems to me that what you're saying is that the family property ownership preceded the creation of the city-state. Is that the case?
Yeah, I would say so. It's obvious that the transition between nomadic hunting and gathering to domesticating animals and getting involved in agriculture would have come before the creation of settlements. It's most likely that families and clans or tribes would then organize by agreements for defensive reasons, unlike most other states founded by the conquest of one group by another. The powers of the early polis were restricted by the same Greek custom that was in place to protect private property. And this stringent protection of property rights lasted well into the later democratic age of the Greek polis.
Well, in what way were they restricted?
The belief in a higher law barred any attempts at lawmaking by a king, a tyrant, or a noble class for centuries. There was no legislator who created and imposed a code of laws upon the ancients. No ancient law originated with the show of hands either. It didn't work that way. The idea of majority rule, for example, did not appear in the polis until hundreds of years later. Early on, laws were cherished as something ancient, undisputable, honored, and far above the authority of mere mortals. These immutable laws had to be obeyed. Violating them was a dishonor and a sacrilege that required atonement. I mean, we have a good example in this, just reading the 12 labors of Heracles. Even though Hera, his let's say, stepmother, tricked him into believing his wife and children were monsters, and Heracles killed them, he was convinced that it was his rage that was responsible for his loved ones' deaths. And even him, the son of Zeus, was obligated to atone. That's what started his 12 labors.
I vaguely remember that from Greek mythology. I don't think you discussed that in the book, though.
No.
I think I remember reading that Aristotle favored the creation of the polis to protect the citizen's sense of morality. How did he view democratic rule?
Aristotle is often intentionally misrepresented on his views of democracy. He argued that it was more proper that the law should govern than any one or group of citizens. He asserted that those nominated to positions of power should be nothing more than guardians or servants of the law. He also showed a great disdain, let's say, for governments where everything is determined by majority vote because no mortal man had the authority to supersede the God's unwritten law. His point was that any form of government, including democracy, would work fine if those in authority did not violate what we now call natural law. And this was later echoed in Rome by Cicero. Now, Cicero, well, at the time they would have called him Cicero, but he argued the same thing. Cicero said that a law that is not based in natural law is no law at all. It shouldn't be even followed.
You know, I'm thinking about current events here, and all these folks who were saying this or that is a threat to democracy, and they have no problem stepping over the Constitution to enforce their idea of what democracy should be. And really, democracy was never mentioned in the Constitution. And in fact, the founders had a great disdain or perhaps fear of democracy.
Exactly.
Which is why we created a constitutional republic. People seem to forget that.
Exactly. There is no question. We do not have a democracy in the United States. It's not a democracy. It is a constitutional republic.
New York,
following what was given to. I'm sorry.
I was going to say New York and California are pissed about that.
Well, of course, anybody.
But the other states are grateful, I think, for the most part.
Exactly. Where do you find democracies? Where do you find, majority rule? Majority rule is mob rule. It's a tyranny of the majority. We understood that. Aristotle understood it. 51%, vote can trample the rights of the 49 that don't agree and their own rights. No, we don't have a democracy in the United States. We have a constitutional republic, and thank God for it. Our founding fathers were wiser than people give them credit for. Our tripartite government comes directly from Sparta, directly from Rome.
Apparently much wiser than some of the folks in Congress and the Senate.
There's no question. Read Cato.
Okay.
Read Cicero. You'll understand perfectly.
Maybe they should have your reading list.
Yeah, well, eventually I'll write something up. But then again, it would be better if they read it in the original languages. But and English translations are good. I mean, I guess, so.
Okay, so let's summarize. So far, you've given us the explanation that the Greek people were more or less fiercely independent, and that they regarded their property as a sacred inheritance with a religious connection to their revered ancestors, I think you said.
Yes.
The ancestral claims to their lands came from the mist, you said, a distant, unrecorded past, probably during the transition. I think you were saying that it came from the transition from nomadic hunter-gatherer family groups to the creation of family farms. Their ownership was based on a belief in laws, and those laws were higher than those that could be written by men. The family farm units were organized by accords to create political organizations for common defense, giving birth to the polis. And the laws governing the polis followed the same cultural traditions as those governing private property ownership. Did I get all that right, or did I screw that up somewhere?
No, that's that you've summed it up quite nicely. It appears to be the case, but the significance of the family farm was far more profound because it influenced every aspect of Greek life: economics, markets, what they would call the agora, trade, and the like. Dr. Victor Davis Hanson has some excellent observations on this very subject, and his views come from a unique personal perspective because he's a gentleman farmer himself, and he comes from I don't know how many generations of farmers. He authored a book called The Other Greeks, The Family Farm and the Agrarian Roots of Western Civilization. In it, he illustrates just how these homesteads became, because of the mild climate in Greece, operated year-round in cycles of planting, cropping, harvesting, and animal husbandry. Now, this distributed the workload throughout the year, but more importantly, it also permitted the Greek citizen farmers time off to participate in the affairs of the polis. The mild climate favored large gatherings of people in outdoor areas for consideration of public concerns. This could not have happened, let's say, in Germany or in Germania or up in the north or in the steppes of Russia. It couldn't happen because the weather was so bad. You'd have to have an enclosure, and you couldn't fit all the people into an enclosure. But in Greece, you could hold these, and in southern Italy, and in Italy in general, you could hold these meetings outside in amphitheaters. So secure property rights were crucial for encouraging long-term family investments in their farms, which also provided both the wealth and the hoplite defense for early Greek city-states. So the Greek character also grew out of a work ethic of hard physical labor and a life of discipline and honor. As I said, you could find this referred to in Hesiod's works and days.
Dr. Tom, I've heard the term hoplite before. They were citizen soldiers, as I recall.
Yes. It comes from the Greek term tahopla, which means tool or equipment. The ancient Greeks would have pronounced it hoplites. I have to add something that is really undervalued in the Greek character, and it's that sense of honor, right? It's still a part of being Greek to even today. They express this relationship with the concept of honor that isn't understood in the same way in other cultures. Believe it or not, it's part of every child's upbringing and is deeply felt as a reminder to avoid shaming themselves before others. It's called philotimo. Loosely, it would be the love of honor. It comes from philo, which means love of, and time, which means honor. So the love of honor. But basically, it's a barometer for a very complex set of virtues involved in personal activities when dealing with others in society. To question a Greek's philotimo is to question his or her morality. This is another aspect of Greek culture that the Romans assimilated into their character. So this concept of philotimia was foundational to what the Greeks would have called arete, later found in the Roman trait of virtute, meaning manliness. Okay, so that all grew out of being, close to the soil with the Greeks and the Romans as well.
I remember us talking about this in the past, and we were saying that the founders understood that without virtue, honor, as you're saying now, the Constitution has very little weight. Because if you don't have a virtuous electorate or a virtuous people in the various positions, political positions, you can't have a democracy. And I'm just wondering, having listened to you now, if the erosion of the family, the idea that many children are born out of wedlock, coming from broken homes, they've lost the care for honor or perhaps even virtue, and that may have contributed to what I see as a decline in our Western democracy.
Well, Western civilization, yes. If you start to knock out the underpinnings of the pillars, of these ancient virtues, of course you're going to have a decline. Of course you're going to have a collapse. What is it that makes man different from animals? You simply have to question that. Are you a man or are you an animal? Do you respond to your environment as a man or as an animal? Are you living in an environment where your survival is some game that that you're trying to play at all costs without considering others, you destroy the family, you destroy a belief in a creator, you destroy a sense of honor, of respect for your ancestors. Then you lose your respect for the future. And, people say the government this, the government that, the government did this. Governments don't do anything. It's people that do things. Governments don't make decisions. People do. And if you have people with no virtue or with very little virtue occupying positions of authority in the government, they'll use that government to follow their own interests. It's that simple. And we see it every day. We see it today. Just take a look at the decline of many of the great cities of the United States. They're falling into complete decline. Why? Now, you ask yourself the question, you'll find the answer.
I have my thoughts on that, but let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the city-states themselves. You said that the same cultural customs that were found in private property ownership were also applied to the governance of the polis. Now, we know that there were regional differences, as you described them, between the city-states, even though the Greeks were pretty much homogeneous in everything else. Did these differences have anything to do with the success of the Greeks and the expansion of their influence on the ancient world?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. Just as each farmstead was a laboratory in developing hybrid grains, crops, and fruits, as well as experimentation with farming techniques, each polis became a proving ground for people to test innovations in politics, economics, and legal policies. Because of the free movement and interaction of people, news from any polis where the laws and customs encouraged innovation and wealth creation were easily disseminated. These ideas were exported from the polis by establishing colonies, aside from traveling and attending games and festivals and religious rites and things like that. So there was a sort of practical utilitarian attitude to use what worked and discard what didn't. Cities which created barriers to commerce, such as duties and high taxes, discouraged agricultural and commercial progress, and they fell into decline. This was precisely how Athens pushed aside Corinth as a major commercial hub in ancient Greece.
You're making me think about the idea of our states versus the federal government, the states being individual laboratories, experimenters, if you will, and people moving between them. We're seeing migrations from states that are restrictive, perhaps failing, to states that are more successful.
Right. And if you look at you're absolutely right. People vote with their feet. And people always vote with their feet to improve their conditions. And
I'm
if they're living in a
that
place,
the founders saw the states more or less as polis, individual polis.
Exactly. They are analogous to the individual. And believe me, that's probably where they got the idea to set it up in that way, to have a federal government that was subservient to the sovereignty of the individual states and the people. That's where they got the idea.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but you're saying that their social and political life was vibrant and dynamic.
Yes, of course it was. That's a great way to describe it. Over time, the clan-based societies began to change with the influx of foreigners and great population growths. You see, because people recognized the advantages of being there, whether they were citizens or not, and they would go into these polis because they sought to improve their lives. And each advance brought more influence to the independent farmers and the wealthy merchants and tradesmen, chipping away at any possible aristocratic advantage or traditional entitlement. The Greeks surely profited both from the inherent reasoning that a good life was the result of the pursuit of individual excellence, along with their business activities being left alone through, politico-economic decentralization.
You know, Dr. Tom, when you think about it, these are some great achievements. We often think of ourselves as light years more advanced than the ancients, but that doesn't really appear to be the case. If I'm understanding you correctly, their private property ownership gave rise to constitutional governments, social ideas of equality under the law.
Right.
And that unleashed, you could say it unleashed economic activity. The freedom to live as they wished, their civilian armies, it sounds like a blueprint for prosperity.
It was. It was. And it was also the blueprint that our founding fathers had in mind for us. Now, you must remember that there was a great distance in time in human history between the Greco-Roman world in 1776. But I have to say that the reintroduction of their early history and thought some 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire into a feudal world served as a source for positive alternatives to kingship, aristocracies, and feudal control of land and resources that were the accepted standard modus vivendi of the day.
Modus vivendi. I'm guessing that means modality, mode of
living.
Mode of living.
The way of life.
Right.
That's way of life.
I did take Latin in 5th grade, but I didn't excel at it.
Yeah, it's the way of life. Modus vivendi. Modus vivendi. Okay.
Okay. I'm going to use some Italian here. Capisco.
Ah, okay. Son contento che mi capisci.
I do know some Italian. And you know that.
Yes, and Spanish too. I know you. Yo sé que tú hablas español también.
Sí, claro.
Claro que sí.
Dr. Tom, I understand that there were some differences between citizenship in Greece and citizenship in Rome. Is that true?
Yes, there was. Whereas in the ancient Greek polis, you had to be from there to be a citizen, basically. But primarily during the empire phase, for the first time, anybody could be a Roman citizen. It didn't matter where you lived. You didn't have to be from Rome or Italy. As long as you declared fidelity to the imperator and acknowledged his divinity, you could have the rights and privileges of any Roman citizen. Now, this allowed Rome to centralize its power in contrast to the Greeks. They had no centralized power. But it also caused a serious vacuum with the collapse. The Roman legions were no longer in place to protect their territories and maintain the amicizia and pax romana. In Britain, for example, the void opened the islands to Anglo-Saxon infiltration. Gaul splintered into many fiefdoms until Charlemagne unified them by conquest. From about 800 AD, vassal states were created throughout Europe and class structures emerged. People lost private property ownership and ownership of their lands, let's say, by the force of arms of warlords and were reduced to an hereditary serfdom, unbreakable poverty, and staggering misery for commoners for centuries.
It sounds like something we should understand and learn from.
No question.
But let's pause a little bit and take a look at feudalism. You mentioned feudalism, or you mentioned serfdom. Just what was it and how did it come about? And I mean, it sounds precisely opposite to what the Greeks created for themselves. What happened?
Exactly. This seems more like the Persian or Asian model than the Greek model of societal organization, with the possible exception of Sparta. It would appear that feudalism in Europe had its origins in the Roman manorial system, where laborers were granted protection while living on large estates. I guess you could say it was similar to sharecropping in the United States after the end of slavery. This pyramidal structure was reiterated in the Frankish kingdom in the 8th century, where a king parceled out land for life to reward loyal nobles and receive services in return. Their obligation was basically to raise funds and fighters from the land. A complex system of agreements between lord and vassal concerning the estates shaped feudal relationships. By the way, feudalism was not a term they would have used to describe this system in the Middle Ages. It appears in French and English legal literature in the 16th century to describe what had become traditional commitments between members of the warrior aristocracy by that time. All right, the term became popular, and it basically entered into general use after about 1750.
Dr. Tom, you spoke of pyramidal structure where the king was the sole sovereign and owned everything, the land, the resources, whatever. Was this also found in the colonies of the European powers outside of Europe? I know that, for instance, our Commonwealth of Pennsylvania began as a land grant to William Penn by the King of England.
Yes, that was the case. The major European powers that took a foothold on American soil, basically England, Spain, France, and Portugal, all followed similar practices. William Penn's story is a little too complex to get into here, but he was given a grant to what is now Pennsylvania and parts of Delaware because of a hefty debt the crown had with his father, Admiral Sir William Penn, Sr. Right? Penn Jr.'s Quaker ideals, however, prompted him to create a religious haven protected by a constitution rather than a colony operating under a commercial charter.
Under the, let me ask you this, under the English political system, was it always this way, or did the fall of Rome also affect the British Isles as well?
Well, the Romans were in Britain for about 400 years. They left in the 4th century, a little bit before the fall of the Western Roman Empire. All of the indications are that private property ownership somehow dissolved by the 8th century with the Viking invasions. Now, we can't be sure when private property ownership went into disuse in the British Isles, but we do know for a fact when feudalism entered.
Well, before I ask you when that was, I mean, it occurs to me that with all the successes that private property gives to their societies, the fact that it can end is a little bit disconcerting. But exactly when was it that feudalism entered?
Well, you were asking about when it could end. It could easily end with an invasion. And in the case of Great Britain, it ended with the Battle of Hastings in 1066. This battle ended the life of King Harold of the Anglo-Saxons and installed Norman rule under William the Conqueror. Now William enforced the French feudal system of land distribution on the defeated Anglo-Saxons and had sole sovereignty and discretion over all of the country's resources. And I mean all of their resources, including animal life.
How did that structure work?
Well, it was basically William followed what he was accustomed to in France. The Frankish, the Frankish tradition that was in France. He retained 20% for himself. He granted 25% to the church and 55% to the barons who sided with him in the conquest. And in the exchange for these land grants, the bishops of the church and the baronial class had only to provide a quota of men and as soldiers for the king in time of need. The two groups had the authority to grant parcels in their turn, that is, parcels of land, to the lesser nobility, who in turn were obligated to either turn over resources or produce, in the case of serfdom, let's say, or rents in the case of freemen, or to further grant parcels for services rendered to others.
When you say granted, you're actually implying an entitlement to the land and not true ownership. Is that the case? For instance, did the king retain any rights over the lands he granted?
Oh, he most certainly did. Here is where we come to the concept of alienable property rights and its codification in the law of entail. You see, they wouldn't have called it feudalism. They would have called it the laws of entail.
Well, having read the book, I asked you a rather leading question because I think I knew the answer there.
Okay.
But for our audience, can you explain this for us?
Sure. Under the law of entail, sometimes they call it a fetail in feudal English law. Basically, any interest in the use of an estate goes solely to the grantee and then forevermore to his direct heirs. Okay? Now, as a basic condition of entail, if the grantee died without descendants, the land returned to the grantor. In other words, the bishop, the baron, or the king. Now, this is where the feudal notion of alienable property rights came into English and eventually into American common law. All right. This law supported basically a landed aristocracy because its aims was to prevent the fragmentation of large estates through divisible inheritance or the lack of heirs. Okay. Now, what this all means is that tangible properties, their resources, and their improvements had a lien placed upon them from a higher level of ownership and were subject to transfer or commerce, even against their will, by the grantor. Okay? The grantee's status was perpetually subservient and at the risk, for any reason, his superior wished to use have their lands taken away. All right? So that's alienable property rights. When they say alienable, they're talking about the right of the superior owner to take it away. Okay?
Right. And as I recall, there were attempts in England to break this stranglehold on property rights. I'm thinking about the Magna Carta. Wasn't that one of them?
Yes, it was. Tyranny will do that. King John was probably the worst despot England ever had. So to avoid a civil war, he was forced to sign the Magna Carta Libertatum on the field. It's famous on the field at Runnymede on June 15th in 1215. It was the result that was enacted by 40 barons in rebellion. Though he consented to their demands, in a mere 10 weeks, Pope Innocent III nullified the agreement. Because basically the church was supporting the kingship in England at the time. Of course, England then was thrown into an internal war. So for all intents and purposes, the Magna Carta was a failed attempt to resolve the conflict between King John and his barons. He died a year later, King John, in 1216. But the charter was reissued several times afterwards with no real beneficial effects.
So I think you're implying that Pope Innocent wasn't so innocent.
Yeah, he wasn't so innocent. No, he was not. Pope, no, not innocent. Pope guilty, he should have been called.
All right, Tom, let me throw you another hanging curve. Can you tell us a little bit about the Magna Carta and its significance to us in the United States? I mean, if it was a failure, why was it remembered with such reverence?
Well, the concepts in it, even though it was a failure to convince the overlord, didn't mean that the concepts in it were invalid or didn't have merit. Well, all right. Well, let's put it just to state off the bat. Okay, we have to say that the desires of the common man or the peasantry were not even considered by the barons in the revolt. Okay, they were interested in protecting their rights and property against a tyrannical king who had what was called an allodial claim or title. Okay. It was also relevant to many other specific grievances related to the feudal system under John. Today in our country, the spirit of the Magna Carta lives on in our Bill of Rights with the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. The two phrases in that charter which illustrate its importance are, quote, no free man shall be taken, imprisoned, deceased, outlawed, banished, or in any way destroyed, nor will we proceed against or prosecute him, except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. And the second one is, quote, to no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice, unquote. Now, if we go to our Fifth Amendment, we'll read, quote, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall property be taken for public use without just compensation.
It sounds almost word for word.
Oh, there's no doubt that they were inspired. The only flaw, maybe I should call it an oversight, was those last three words, without just compensation.
Why so?
Well, think about it. They enshrined an idea that your property can be taken against your will, as long as they give you just compensation. In other words, they were probably more interested in the loss of wealth by an uncompensated usurpation, an outright theft, rather than the more important immorality of violating your right to do with your property as you see fit in the absence of coercion. Okay.
So why did a legal term, usually associated with tangible property or real estate rights, wind up in our Declaration of Independence being applied to our tangible natural rights?
So you're talking about unalienability, right? Well, it is the reasonable applicable extension of the idea of self-ownership or individual sovereignty. You see, this notion is based upon the Judeo-Christian creation belief in liberum arbitrium, or free will, resulting in the God-given moral and natural right of every individual to be the exclusive controller of their own body and life. John Locke said it best. He said, every man has a property in his own person and has a right to decide what would become of himself and what he would do, and is having a right to reap the benefits of what he did. In other words, our lives, intellect, labor, everything that we produce, and our resultant wealth and assets are considered our unalienable property, which belongs to us and is not subject to transfer or sale without our approval. In essence, no liens may be placed upon the moral expression of our inherited natural rights, nor its fruits. Now, Locke, however, I have to say, he conceded that the highest authority is God the Creator, as being the ultimate grantor of self-ownership. Thus, only he and no other earthly power had the claim of alienation upon our natural and personal rights when they're regarded as property.
So you're saying that our founding fathers found the idea of having a lien placed upon our property, both tangible and intangible, to be, I guess, antithetical to Republican ideals based on the self-evident realities of individual sovereignty and perhaps the right to pass on the fruits of our labor to our offspring.
Yes, absolutely. If there were no contractual guarantees underlying a financial claim to it, in other words, if you didn't use your property as a guarantee by taking a loan or something like that, but under normal circumstances, yes, that's absolutely what they believed. And we know that this was on their minds because shortly after the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, Thomas Jefferson returned to the Commonwealth of Virginia and in October of that same year introduced a statute to abolish entails. Many other states followed his lead and did the same. By this action alone, we can be certain that our forefathers, our founders, were well aware of these concepts in law. You see, Americans were no longer subjects of the British Crown, but free citizens of their own country.
All right, the word unalienable, we're pronouncing it right. You know that from the book. Unalienable has a different meaning in the minds of most people today. In fact, they almost universally pronounce it incorrectly. I read the book. I already know the answer to my next question, so I'm going to send you another hanging curve. But for our audience, can you briefly tell us just when and why has the definition of the word unalienable been altered? And maybe you could go into the implications of why we're having two different meanings for the same word.
Yes. It was, it was seemingly intentional. In any case, if you were to do a cursory review of our dictionaries, they show that the word's meaning, along with its proper pronunciation, was gutted, decontextualized, and diluted during the progressive administrations of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. The change in the definition first started to appear in American dictionaries around the year 1910. Right? This was the result, basically, of the steady infiltration of Marxist dogma, which attacked the existence of natural rights, derided the idea of private property ownership, and insisted against it, and also insisted that one's labor was a property to be employed for the so-called collective good, rather than being expressions of free will derived from our natural personhood. All that Marxism and its many derivatives propose, therefore, is a return to a form of medieval feudalism where the divine rights of kings are replaced by the coercive theft of an individual's labor by elitist committees. The subtle intent of redefining the word unalienable was akin to taking the first chip out of the cornerstone of our founding documents. It permitted the insincere criticism and eventual deliberate misrepresentation of our primary principles and purposes. I mean, what they did was they kept the word and changed the definition. It is a tactic that the left uses all the time.
Yes, I think I've seen that from time to time. What I find interesting is that I was never exposed to the ideas we're talking about before reading your book and your father's lessons to you as a kid. How can people in our government honestly say that they're following the spirit of our Constitution as intended by the founders if they continue to draft and approve laws that are drawing upon an altered definition of the word unalienable? I guess I'm saying if our rights really cannot be sold or transferred without our approval, then those laws violate, at the very least, the spirit of constitutional protections. In other words, what we're saying is that a person's natural rights can be at times taken from them, but under no circumstances can their rights be aliened, that is, sold or transferred.
Well, Rob, you'll get no argument from me. Sadly, these concepts are being eroded as we speak. Both the long struggle for improving the lives of the common man in Western civilization and the institution of private property are under continuous assault everywhere we look, especially in colleges and universities. I mean, who studies classical antiquity anymore? Ancient Greece and Rome. Who learns their languages? Who looks for context in the words of our founding documents where the past was seen as a proving ground to instruct, the present was a template to correct, and the future was a promise to avoid tyranny and misery. When ancient Greece is mentioned at all, it is either derided, contorted, or twisted to support some left-wing ideological cause or to justify some sexual proclivity. There is a great damage to ourselves and our children and a dishonor to our forebears in not knowing the struggles of our ancestors.
Dr. Tom, I think based on that and on that note, I think we've come to the end of this episode. Is there a way we could wrap this up for our audience?
Well, I guess, a brief summary, there is no doubt of the positive success of Western civilization, of our Western civilization. We also cannot deny that we are indebted to the ancient Greeks for their exceptional view of their place in the world, their institutions, and their ideas. The inviolability of private property shared by the majority of Greek city-states strongly influenced the Romans, who then incorporated them into their civil society. Through their expansion, the Romans were then able to disseminate those Greek ideals over a wider field in the ancient world through medieval France and England. The Greco-Roman view of life, infused with the Judeo-Christian traditions, affected later writers and philosophers of the Enlightenment who inspired America's founders. And, that's where we are. That was the promise of the American founders, to give a rebirth to the ancient Greek and Roman philosophies of control over our own lives.
Well, I think you've made it perfectly clear, or at least I hope so. So we're going to end here. Thank you, Dr. Tom. And by the way, in the next episode, we're going to be discussing the classes of rights. The classes of rights. There's natural and personal versus positive rights, which are civil and political. Until next time, this is Robert Melso inviting you to think about this discussion and the risk we and our children face without having this knowledge about our history. Thanks again, Dr. Tom.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Rob.
You've been listening to The Liberty Brief, based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters by Dr. Thomas Giordano. If you want to help spread the word, please subscribe, like, and share using the links below. You can also check out Dr. Giordano's book on Amazon using the links as well.